Pupil. I'm Heather Huff. I'm the Executive Director of PACE, and this is the PACE Seminar Series. Once a month, we feature topics from getting down to facts and enable the room of folks that are here to dig into those findings with the researchers and talk about what we've learned and what some of those implications are. So for anyone that doesn't know, Getting Down to Facts is a collaborative research project, involved over 100 researchers from California and the nation, and produced 36 reports and 19 policy briefs that covered a wide range of topics. The goal of Getting Down to Facts was really to take stock. We're in a period of incredible transition with a new SPI, a new governor, and that means that we have lots of opportunities. So what's going well, and where do we still need to make improvements to keep things moving in the right direction? We focused on 4 different areas: student success, governance, personnel, and finance. Today we're going to be digging in mostly on finance, but we'll also talk about governance to some extent as well. And to orient these studies into the larger set, across all of these pieces, what we found is that California is generally going in the right direction. We've put in a lot of changes to our accountability systems, to our funding systems, that are showing some positive results and also have widespread support. But we're not all the way there yet. We still have some serious problems in our system that need to be addressed. And some of the things that are pointed out in our study are that we need to build capacity to make full use of some of the changes that have already been put in place. And we also need to make new changes to fix the systems that implement a lot of these changes, particularly around finance. And so we'll dig into a couple of those areas today. So to introduce you to your speakers, we have 2 esteemed speakers today who were involved in the Getting Down to Facts studies. Jeff Vincent is the Deputy Director and co-founder of the Center for Cities and Schools at Berkeley. And our second speaker is Paul Warren, who's currently a research associate at the Public Policy Institute of California. But before that, had a long and illustrious career in California policymaking at the Legislative Analyst's Office, with the Assembly, and also with the California Department of Education. So for today, what we will do is start with a presentation from Jeff Vincent on facilities funding. Then we'll do question and answer specifically for and with Jeff. Then we'll move over to a discussion with Paul, and then we'll have a question and answer period with Paul. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Jeff Vincent up to the stage.
I haven't said anything yet, actually, so I appreciate the clapping. Well, thanks so much, Heather. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Actually, I'll just set that there. So facility financing, it doesn't get any sexier than that, right? One of my jobs always is to make people be interested in school facilities and school facility funding because I think it's important. And I got into this not because I care about money. I actually don't care about money, and I hate dealing with money. I care about the conditions of school facilities. And really the best way, well, one of the best ways to do that is to follow the money. And so at my center at Berkeley, we look at the ways in which we're education policy people and kind of urban design, built environment people, really looking at the ways in which places structure success for obstacles for children and families, and we spend a lot of time researching the built environment or the place of school facilities. And I've done that in California and nationally. And so, you know, doing this study for Getting Down to Facts, really looking at what have Californians spent on school facilities over the last 10 years and how does that compare to the 10 years prior. You know, doing that in 2018 is a great time marker because the school facility program, which I'm assuming half of this room probably knows intimately, and half of this room has never heard that term before walking in this room. So I'm going to try to strike a nice balance. But the school facility program, which is basically the state of California's contribution to local school districts for school construction, new construction, and what's called modernization of school facilities. That's called the School Facility Program, and it was started, as we know it today, it was started in 1998. So it's pretty much exactly 20 years of learnings about how those dollars have gone out, who or which districts and students have received those dollars. And I think it's a great kind of point in time to think about, okay, obviously with getting down to facts, what do we know about the successes of those things and needs going forward? And how might new leadership or current leadership think about whether or not we should make any tweaks going forward? And so it's really great to have this study at that time. And long story short, the school, it was just detailed in the paper, but the school facility program started in 1998, as I said, and basically since that time it has provided over $40 billion. I think it's about $44 billion in grants to school districts. There's been a number of different categories of those funds. By and large, the two largest categories are new construction and modernization. And those dollars are awarded to school districts that come forward with eligible projects. And there's a state-local match on those for eligible costs, which really, if we get into that, we're really getting into the minutia. But it's a 50-50 state-local match for new construction, and it's a 60-40 state-local match on modernization. So I think that's a good context as we get into this. So, and if you remember, in November of 2018, there was a proposition on the ballot. We voted a proposition, so what did I say, 2016, sorry, about $7 billion for school construction to sort of refill funding within the school facility program. And just conferring with some of my colleagues is that pretty much $7 billion passed November 2016. Basically, this coming spring, all of those dollars will be spoken for in terms of the need. So there's a great need out there among school districts for new construction, modernization, other facilities things. So, okay, what I'm going to do very quickly in the 15 minutes that I have is answer these research questions which we looked at, which is how has the level of school facility funding in California changed over time, and how does that compare to prior levels? And in other states. How is funding for new school construction and modernization distributed across school districts? And are disparities in school facility funding systematically related to local property wealth, income, and or the share of disadvantaged students, and also the racial ethnic composition of those school districts? So we do tests for all of those things. And then we also look at how has school facility funding for charter schools changed, and sort of what's the status of that. Given the time, I'm actually not going to talk about the charter school piece, but we can certainly talk more about it. And it's a very, relatively speaking, it's a small wedge of the overall funding pie of facilities. So how has the level changed over time? Can you guys see this? It seems really dull to me, but, or not, sorry. It seems less sharp and vivid, let's just say. So nothing dull about this line. This line basically shows overall school capital funding. So capital is, school districts kind of have two main budgets, right? They have their operating budget, that's their LCFF dollars, et cetera, the paid teachers, et cetera. Then they have their capital budget. They may or may not have any money in that depending on local bonds and developer fees, et cetera. So this is tracking total per pupil facility spending on the capital side from 70 to 2016. And you can see a lot of volatility in that. And we put some of the markers with some of the measures and really hit a peak in the mid-2000s. Great Recession hit and a huge drop-off, right? So in terms of a school district's perspective, and it's getting that 50-50 or that 60-40 match from the state, school districts aren't terribly sure how far into the future that money is going to be available. And that's a sort of a reality that they have experienced, which I'll circle back to later, but it presents a lot of challenges locally on the ground. And so how do we compare to other states? I think that you can see this in the report. I would say that basically what happened was that we, in the 90s, we as a state were really behind particularly a lot of the other big growth states, the Texases and the Floridas, et cetera. And then we played catch up. We passed a lot of bonds statewide and a lot of bonds locally in the 2000s, right? We had tremendous overcrowding in places like LAUSD and other places, did a lot of building and actually jumped up, but you can see other states were still not, we were catching up to them, but we played catch up, and then the latter part or the mid part of after 2010, we dropped off again. And so you can see even over like the 20 or 15 years, we're close to what other states have been doing, give or take. But again, knowing what another state does not mean that they're doing it perfectly, and it also is driven by growth rates, et cetera. So just to give you a sense, I think sometimes we do pat ourselves on the back for doing a lot through the school facility program when in fact we were really playing catch up around overcrowding and growth, things that we weren't addressing in the 80s and 90s. And so, okay, where do school districts get dollars for their facilities on the capital side? They primarily get it through kind of 4 buckets, but local general obligation bonds, then the state aid, which is usually through the state bonds, and then developer fees, and then there are a few other smaller pieces of funds that they can get. But what you can see broken out over the last almost 20 years, so I mean, one of the things that Getting Down to Facts did was sort of look at the last 10 years and then the 10 years prior, and that's what I'll mostly do in this. But you can see that a real drop in state aid happened after about 2006. And so there were no new statewide bonds between 2007 and 2015. And so what you see is a big drop in the percentage of dollars spent. There was about 30% of all the monies was state aid, and that dropped in the last 10 years to about 13% of state aid. So what that meant is more reliance on local bonds. And of course, a decline in developer fee revenues. And people talk about the school facility program as kind of a 3-legged stool of funding: state aid through state bonds, local general obligation bonds, and developer fees. And while that was largely the case, you know, in the early 2000s, that is far less the case in the more recent years. So you went from total revenue of about $10 billion for developer fees, and then down to $3.6 billion for the last decade. So a real drop on that side of things. And that goes hand in hand with kind of the decline in the housing market. Total revenue for facility investment approximately 27% lower during the last 10 years than it was the 10 years prior, from about $94 billion down to just under $70 billion. What does that mean? A heavier reliance on local bonds. Here's just a graphic of that, just to sort of show you with colors that distribution. But you can see that the local slice of that pie, the red one, gets a lot bigger as a share of that. And we'll circle back to that in terms of the disparity issues. So how is capital funding for new school construction and modernization distributed across school districts? And this is kind of, you know, one of the things we cared mostly about in the paper. And so what we find is that there are a lot of disparities in access to capital dollars. And really, the main reason for that is a great difference in local property wealth. And what you find is, looking at percentiles of students, you can see that 10% of students are getting much smaller amounts of dollars than, as you move up the percentiles of students, they're getting almost 3 times the amount of funds. And I want to break that down through the next set of slides. So are disparities in school facility funding systematically related to school district property wealth, median household income, and or racial ethnic composition of school districts? And so the charts that I'm going to show you now are really for the most recent decade. In the case of our study, it's 2006 to 2015. And there's, of course, a data lag on some of this stuff. So, you know, that's why we end at 2015. How are we doing on time? I feel like I'm racing through this. We're good? Okay. So first, distribution of revenue per pupil by quintiles of enrollment growth. So the districts over here had the most enrollment growth. Districts over here had the least amount of enrollment growth during that 2006 to 2015. And what I do, all these charts will be the same. These are sources of funds. So blue is local geo bonds. This orange is state aid, green is developer fees, and then yellow is other. And so you can see both the composition as well as the overall cumulative sum among those. And so what we find is that, you know, the districts with the most enrollment growth had the most capital revenues. And in part that makes sense because they were probably building new schools or building additions to house all or provide seats for all of those students. But you can see it's not a clear slope, right? So now we move to distribution of revenue per pupil by quintiles of median household income. And what we find is that, so again, higher household incomes over here, lower over here. And what we find is that school districts that have higher median household incomes were getting a lot more facility revenues. And you can see that is true certainly on local. Look at the difference in access to local bonds compared to their lower wealth neighbors. But what you also see is look at the state bonds contribution to that. Fairly similar across here, but you actually do find that state aid is higher per student. These are all on a per student in the lower wealth districts. And that's a good sign, certainly, in my opinion. So the other category can be a smattering of things: certificates of participation, parcel taxes, if they got FEMA aid for some emergency. There's a few, Mello-Roos, other kind of special taxing, and we can get into that, but that Roos, I was chastised the other day for pronouncing that wrong. There are a few other mechanisms that districts can use to raise dollars for capital funding, but by and large in California it tends to be local general obligation bonds. Mello-Roos is one of those tools. So, okay, so let's do the same thing and look at distribution of revenue per pupil by quintiles of assessed value per pupil, right? And so this is the assessed property value in the district, of which really is very related to the dollars that they can generate through local bonds locally. And what you find is that higher assessed values over here, lower assessed values over here, and you can see the higher wealth districts, higher property wealth districts are generating far more money per student than lower wealth districts, right? And so this is a pattern that we found, throughout the different ways that we sliced and diced the research. Okay, perfect. And just if you're curious, what I'm showing, actually, I forgot to mention this, what I'm showing are the findings on these for unified school districts, because we also do it for elementary school districts and for high school districts. So, okay, distribution of revenue per pupil by quintiles of share of disadvantaged students, and we use the unduplicated pupil counts in this. And what you find is these are the districts with more disadvantaged children. These are the districts with fewer. And what you see is the opposite there in terms of, I'm sorry, did I say that backwards? I did say that backwards. Yes, I'm sorry, I did. So these districts over here have a greater share of disadvantaged students. These districts have a lesser share. And so what you're seeing is that those districts that serve fewer disadvantaged students are certainly have access to more local bond money, right? What we use in here is the UPC count. I think it's 2015, I think is what it is. We looked at it then, of course, by race, ethnicity of students, and there's a share of non-white students. You actually find a little more evenness in this than you do related to some of those other things. So it's not really a story necessarily just of race per se, as it is to income and property values, what we found. Okay, so implications. With 4 minutes left, I'll move to implications. What does this kind of mean for the state going forward? As we say in the paper, the school facility program has been tremendously positive. It has generated a lot of dollars both at the state level and at the local level. Because one of the things that's really fundamentally different between the capital dollars and so general obligating is that local and state money kind of leverage each other, right? And so the state money is really predicated on locals kind of raising dollars as well. And so, but what we found in the looking at the numbers is California's system of school facility finance is relatively regressive. And here's another way to kind of look at what we did, but this is characteristics of districts by quintiles of assessed value. So this is the highest assessed value, and this is the lowest assessed value. And you see, I don't know if you guys can see this, percent poor, percent non-Hispanic white, and percent Hispanic. And basically you see that, just looking at percent poor, the places that have higher AV, assessed value, have 45% poor children, whereas the places with the lowest AV have 75%. poor kids on average. And so you see a relationship between assessed value and the way in which we think of sort of disadvantage in students. But most interestingly in the paper, what we found is that, remember I said there's a new construction pot and a modernization pot, right? And what we found is actually on the new construction side, dollars were allocated fairly equitably, and in large part that's driven because you can't qualify as a school district for new construction dollars if you can't show that you are generating sort of unhoused or kids that don't have seats, essentially. And enrollment growth was actually fairly equitably distributed across the state, just by chance. It may not be in the future, but it was. And so what we found is really the inequities are on the modernization side. And so I want to show you, again, here's a similar table, characteristics of districts receiving modernization funding by quintiles of funding. So the districts over here, the fifth of districts over here, receive the most money. And here, this is, I think I have a little animation here for you. Assessed value. Look at the difference in assessed value. The districts that got the most have $2.3 million per student in assessed value, whereas those that got the least have less than half of that. If you look at students, percent poor, 62% compared to 50%. And if you look at, this is supposed to just be on this, but what we find too is this category is actually districts that got no state aid through the school facility program. And on average, they only have 1,250 students. So what we found is that if you're rural, and particularly if you're small, you tended to get a lot less fewer dollars for, fewer dollars through the state program. Again, this is median income by quintiles of modernization funding. So you can see that places with higher median incomes were getting a lot more dollars per student. There's a clear relationship between, this is assessed value per pupil, and this is general obligation bond funding up the side. There's a clear correlation between if you have greater assessed value, you're getting more local bond dollars. So what are the implications? Despite past investment, K facility needs remain high across the state. Clearly this differs from district to district. The instability in state funding does present local challenges because doing capital and facility planning, that's a long-term 5, 10, even longer year process. Local ability to raise facility funds varies enormously. And just to give you a sense of that, the lowest AV in the student is around $25,000. The highest is over $50 million per student. It's enormous. AV per student percent of statewide average. These are all the districts in the state. If the statewide average is here, part of it is you have a whole bunch of districts that actually really high property values. Changing enrollment trends mean changing facility funding priorities. And really, the 90s and the early 2000s, very strong enrollment growth across the state. I'm almost done, I promise. Very strong enrollment growth across the state. We invested a lot in new school construction, but if you look statewide, that enrollment growth has largely slowed tremendously, largely almost flattened. There are certainly areas of growth, but we may need to really, where the facility needs are by and large, are in existing schools. Knowing statewide facility needs remains elusive. We do not have a statewide inventory of the conditions or square footages of all the buildings, so it's really actually hard to target precisely to where upgrades are needed. And then, questions of state oversight. And I think, we sort of end the paper talking about, okay, we're really now, in the era of LCFF and local accountability in the way in which we're learning from that and we've defined that. And what does that mean on the facility side, which we really was sort of not dealt with at all in any of the LCFF legislation or implementation. And so I think that's it. There's lots more details in the paper, but overall we found lots of money being spent, lots of money being generated, but a real inequity in access to those funds, particularly on the modernization of existing schools. So, thanks. With that, I would love to entertain questions, comments, corrections. I welcome any corrections. Yeah.
Jennifer Bester from Educate Our State. When we looked at the 2016 measure, what we found was that wealthier districts tended to have better, larger administrations that were therefore able to support both the necessary bond drives locally and also fill in all the paperwork and so forth. One thing that we're seeing now with really significant disparities in cost of living between counties, where like the 6 Bay Area counties, Santa Cruz, Orange, San Diego, and Ventura, all have a significantly higher than average cost of living. So that means with a flat LCFF, they're having to cut back somewhere. Turns out they're cutting back on administration. So did you, I mean, among other things, but that's one place that we're seeing drops. Did you measure the disparities? Because what that means is that the poor districts in the wealthy counties, so Alameda district or Ravenswood or Oakland or any of those, is cutting back on administration. So they're less likely to be able to apply for state aid. They're less likely to be able to get local bonds. Have you cut your data at all that way? Is that something?
In terms of actually looking at staffing or personnel in relation to access to capital
well,
dollars?
looking at school districts in wealthy areas, in wealthy counties,
right.
or in high-cost counties.
You know, for this we didn't. In some other research we have. I mean, that's the thing is like there. While it's mostly true that sort of, you know, lower wealth school district serving, you know, poorer families are in lower property value areas. That's not always the case, and so that's why one of the things that I think having a state formula and a state program that addresses the variety of places, whether you're talking about weather and its impact on facilities, or you're talking about differences between property values and say family incomes, et cetera, is really hard because there's so much variation. So I have not looked at it like that. One of the things that we have looked at, well, the things that you say are true is that, you know, we did a study earlier this year on small and rural school districts, and we did interviews and crunched the numbers on them, and by and large they are less likely to have had local bonds and far less likely to have state dollars. And part of the reason they say that is the case is that, you know, voter appetites differ certainly, but they just don't have the technical expertise on staff to do sort of the facility planning and real estate planning that they probably need to do or know they need to do, but aren't doing it. And then also there is a perception, I think we heard this a lot, about sort of the complexity of the state program in terms of accessing funds. But you can certainly hire folks to do that work for you, and a lot of school districts do. One of the things that I have found with districts, kind of the examples that you describe, is that we didn't do it for this paper, but in other studies we've looked at, because capital dollars are not the only dollars that school districts spend on their facilities. They basically spend, I mean, if you've looked at budgets, they have maintenance and operations, right? And that's security, that's cleaning and utilities and these kinds of things. And then you have the capital dollars. And what we have found looking at both of those things for individual districts is that lower wealth districts tend to spend more per student on maintenance and operations, and those coming from LCFF dollars, right? Which we thought, oh, that's probably a good thing, because I kind of know a lot of those lower wealth districts have older buildings, or perhaps they have higher deferred maintenance. But then looking at the capital side, what we found is on average they tend to have less access to capital dollars. And what happens is that, you know, where a district is repairing or replacing a roof, let's just say, they would rather use capital dollars for that. But they may actually not have enough for one reason or another, and they're using LCFF dollars, right? There's sort of a gray area of things that can be done for capital. I mean, you're not going to build a whole new school with your LCFF dollars, obviously. But some of these relatively smaller projects, which can be costly. And that was a big signal to us, like, wow, they're sort of undercapitalized, right? Which is putting more pressure on their LCFF budgets. I have no idea if I answered your question, but those are some insights that we have seen. And I would love to look at staffing and those things related to this. One of the things we have found, and then you can move on to the next one, is that, you know, in the budget crises that districts will report that usually the first staffings that get cut are on facility operations and custodial and those kinds of things. And LEO has found that, and I've heard that anecdotally across districts.
Other questions?
I'll give an answer that goes way out here and then comes back to the.
No, this is super easy, I promise. I mean, this shows my lack of knowledge because I'm in credentials, not in facilities. But you said 50-50 match for new building, 60-40 for modernization. That's 60 that the state provides and 40 that the local?
Yes.
Thank you. That was it.
And that was changed. It used to be a different, this table over here will know what it was. 80-20, that's right. It was lowered or shifted to the locals at 60-40.
Ron Rapp, California Federation of Teachers. So based upon your findings, and I know that there is a proposal for putting a bond issue on the ballot in 2020. Obviously, there's a need. Based upon your findings, what changes need to be made to the school facilities program, in your mind? Besides more money.
I think there are 3 things that need to be very seriously considered. The first one is that it seems to me, given the very strong relationship between assessed property values in a district and their access to facility capital dollars, that the state should look at some sort of sliding scale formula that is wealth adjusted. We have studied how other states do that. There's about 2/3 of the states in this country provide capital dollars to school districts. Over half of those formulas are wealth adjusted. They have different ways of doing that. They may only look at AV. They may also look at median household income. They may bump you up if you have more disadvantaged children. There's different math. In the math, there's different ways to do it. But by and large, wealthy districts get a smaller share from the state, and disadvantaged districts or poorer districts get more. I think that should be seriously considered. I think, too, that the school facility program, as it sits now, is by and large a first come, first serve kind of thing. So you apply on a project by project basis, you get in line. If I apply today and you apply tomorrow, I'm one step ahead of you in the line. That line is really not dictated by how bad my school is that I'm applying for versus how bad your school is. There are some things like hardship provisions that can be done, but I would say they're not systemic to the program. So I think the state needs some mechanism to be able to perhaps shift away, particularly on modernization, from a first come, first serve to looking at need. Some other states do this where they say, okay, all the projects need to be in by July 1st. We're gonna actually look at them, and we know we have this amount of money. We've deemed these X projects as sort of the worst, and they're gonna get first funding. Not an easy thing to do. And then thirdly, I would say that related to that, I still think that, you know, it should be a local control is paramount, and locals should be deciding what projects and what schools they want to work on. But like we have LCAPs, and I know people love them and hate them, and we're learning how to do them better, I think. I think we need something analogous or some piece of it that is sort of an LCAP around facilities, a facility master plan. District-wide master plan is sort of the parlance. Some districts do them well. Some districts don't have the capacity to do them, I think, well. But that being said, if you apply to the state's program, it seems that the State Allocation Board or OPSC, the Office of Public School Construction, should know that when you bring a project forward that, yeah, it's in your plan. It makes sense you're bringing this project forward. It sort of seems to have the most sort of deficiencies or needs for improvement compared to the rest of your portfolio, which right now they don't have any way, to my knowledge, to be able to do that.
And for Jeff?
No. I'm just going to make this a simple one. I mean, well, actually, a couple things. One is that in one of your charts on the distribution of revenue by per pupil by quintiles of median household, I mean, you kind of show that, you know, the state level, the lower income levels students are actually getting, you know, actually higher dollar per student than even the higher income level. So, I mean, can you argue that perhaps the program is working? That's one thing. And then secondly, I mean, I do understand the need to look at, you know, wealth of districts, but on the other hand, what about the age of the facilities and the conditions of the facilities? So, okay, sorry, 2 questions.
No, that's really good. I mean, so she is right to point out, absolutely, and what we found in the findings, and you'll see it in the brief, is that the state, particularly on the modernization program distribution, is that the state funds do little to remedy the disparities in access, except at the very low end. And so what that tells you is that we have, the school facility program has called hardship kind of provision, and if you qualify, you can get, up to 100% of eligible costs in terms of state aid, and that'll vary. But so it seems to be working at the very low end, but it's everyone above the very low end, sort of in that middle, I think, that is what we found is sort of still, you know, needs the help. And so, but you're right, thank you for pointing that out. And so clearly the hardship piece is working, but I would argue that it's not working well enough. How do you get more people to qualify for hardship, or how do you expand that criteria up or something to assist those districts that didn't quite qualify for hardship, but they're just above whatever that cutoff line is, and I think that's a challenge. And then on the conditions, you know, like I said before, I would much rather be showing you metrics of actual facility conditions and measures of educational suitability than I would be following the money. Because really, I mean, that's one of the, we use money as a proxy really for conditions. And so, because really, if Heather has reasonably good facilities and they actually suit her program really well, you wouldn't expect that she needs a lot more money right now. Versus if you had, if your facilities could not be described that way, you would need more money, or if you had more growth. And so that's one of the things, is that what we don't have in California is a statewide inventory of schools. We don't know exactly how many buildings we have. We don't know how many square feet we have, and we don't know the ages of them. So what we have done is do estimates of those things based on square footage standards, based on loading standards, and based on the number of schools that we have. And so in our studies, we've done that, and then figured out how much that means it costs to take care of them. But you know, easily 30% of our school buildings out there are over 50 years old. So one of my mantras has always been, we need better information and data. And I say that actually not as a researcher, I actually say it as a taxpayer, to be quite honest. So, good questions. Okay, thank you all.
And keep clapping. We'll welcome up Paul Warren now.
Hi, Paul Warren with Public Policy Institute of California. Revisiting special ed finance is titled that way because we did a report on special ed finance in 2016, that looked at the formula that the state uses to distribute special ed monies, how it's distributed across the state to districts, and its connection to how special education is run, the governance issues. So this kind of follows up on that and looks at some of the same issues and extends some of those issues, the discussion of options that the state may have in addressing some of the things that we looked at. Ooh, what did I do? There. So I'm going to talk about the main special ed funding formula. It's called AB 602 after the bill. Then I'll look at briefly on special ed preschool, and then I have one slide on governance and accountability to cover the second half of the report. But but the finance parts are kind of the most salient at this point. So just to kind of brief you on what the first report said, it said that, gee, you know, the funding formula, which is based on the number of students that attend in each district, not the number of special ed students, but the number of total students. So when AB 602 was passed, we said, well, we spend X amount, let's say $10 billion on special ed, and what we're going to do is, if we had 1 million students, then we're going to provide $1,000 for each of those 1 million students, even though only 10% of that 1 million students were special ed kids, okay? So for every kid, you get a little plop of money. It's about $500 for every child that attends at your school and district. And then that money, though, is reserved for the services that go just to special ed kids. And it was done that way for several reasons. Previous formulas were based on what kind of classroom kids were in. It was based on the number of special ed kids, but there was a concern that, that we were creating inappropriate incentives to identify kids for services in special ed, because there's other programs that also address student needs. So, so it's now based on just the total ADA, average daily attendance of special ed students. So this is just a very basic breakdown of who pays for the services that special ed students receive. You can see here the lion's share is districts. Of course, this 60% includes the share that comes to them as base funds that all students, you know, pays for the services of all students, right? So there's a classroom for every student, including special ed. And a portion of that 60% also pays for the additional services that special ed students get. Then the state and federal funds make up about 40% of the cost of special education. And those are dedicated funds that the state and the federal government provide just for special ed students and cannot be spent for other things. So one of the things we looked at in our first report is how special ed costs have changed over time. And what we saw is that because district costs are rising, you know, districts were starting to feel stressed about their special education budget. So there's a couple of reasons why district costs are rising. The number of disabled students is increasing. Starting in about 2007, we saw special ed caseloads rising fairly quickly. And even though the number of students statewide, total students, was about the same. It wasn't going up, it was pretty flat. As you may know, about half of districts are in a declining enrollment status. That is, they're losing students because of variety of reasons. And but in those, when you go talk to folks in declining enrollment districts, what they tell you is that the number of special ed students doesn't seem to go down as quickly as the overall attendance in their district. And so that just means that their cost relative to their overall budgets is creeping up. Other kinds of cost increases in districts also increases special ed costs, just like it increases the cost for any program. If you pay teachers more, then that's going to increase your special education program. So those kinds of things also boost what districts spend on special ed. But because the state and federal pot are fixed, when costs go up, the districts end up having to pay for the additional cost of special ed in their regular general fund. And that pushes out other things that maybe they would like to do. Now, in our first report and in this report, we recommend that you stick with that ADA-based funding. And the reason is that it creates the right incentives for districts. And I'll get into this in a little bit more detail in just a second. But some groups have proposed that we might adjust the AB 602 formula to recognize the growth in, say, autism, because autism has been growing very quickly. It's very high cost in a lot of cases. And so there's a feeling that, well, that's a pretty defined kind of disability and not likely to be subject to a lot of inappropriate incentives to identify kids in those areas. So what we did in this paper is we looked at the distribution of special ed kids across the state. And this is a figure that shows each color represents 20% of students. And what you see is that the percent of students who are identified as disabled starts at 7.6% in one county. That's the lowest. And at the high level, it's 16.8%. So that's obviously a pretty good sized spread. The high county is Calaveras, which is a mountain county east of Stockton. The low county is Tulare, which is a valley county down near Bakersfield. Okay, and so we went and we looked at what kinds of students are in special ed in these two counties. And this chart shows that as well as the state average, which is the red in the middle. And what you see is that in Calaveras, almost every category, there's a higher percentage of kids identified as disabled in those categories than in Calaveras, and indeed as compared to the state average. So what's going on here? What's going on is, and I talked to the folks in each of these counties and asked them that, and we had a good dialogue about how their programs run. Okay, in Tulare, special ed is the last in a series of interventions for kids. They might start with, for a student that's struggling in school, they might start with tutoring, or they might have a little pull-out program, but it's a series of interventions that result in special ed if these interventions don't seem to make a difference. So they're able to address student needs short of identifying them as disabled. In Calaveras County, special ed, and this is the words of one person I talked to, is the gateway to additional services for students. So that means in order to get some time of additional attention, you have to be identified. And so you're seeing really the results of how these programs operate. So if we based funding on these kinds of data, what we would get is Calaveras would get a lot more money than Tulare. And I don't think that's something that really makes a lot of sense. So what are our options? Our options is, instead of changing the pupil count, we change the way that we increase the total pot of money for special ed every year. One way to do that, which is my favorite, is the second one, which is that we say the state share ought to be constant over time at the state level, and we'll make the adjustment every year in the COLA so that the state share, say 31%, is what the state pays every year. And that would kind of keep the state's commitment to special ed at a constant level. Special ed, preschool, well, 4-year-olds are not students in the eyes of the state, and so they don't get counted as part of average daily attendance. So a district that wants to boost its effort to identify kids early and get them into services as 4-year-olds or 3-year-olds has no funding source for that. And here we can see, this is the one cohort of students that started at age 3 and ends at age 6. And what you see is that there's a pretty large growth in the number of kids that are identified for special ed. And really the growth are in categories language, and autism that I think they would really benefit to get into services early, and are the kinds of disabilities that maybe are more apparent. And perhaps we should have identified the majority of those kids. So I think this is a concern that we raise in this paper. And there's a couple of options, again, for addressing this problem. One is to say, okay, now we'll count them as average daily attendance. And as districts get more of these kids, they will get funding to address their issues. Or another way, which was recommended by a task force that met in 2015, is to have a lesser grant for each student, recognizing that these are not always full-day programs, and that there are other options for serving these kids like Head Start and preschool programs. So I'm going to skip over the governance and accountability. And if you want to talk about it, I'd be happy to, but I'm out of time.
Questions for Paul?
Paul, you mentioned that 4-year-olds aren't part of ADA for the purpose of this calculation. Are TK 4-year-olds counted just from that technical
Yes, I
perspective?
believe they are.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's just not those in preschool?
Yes.
Got it.
I'm sorry, you have to try again. I can't hear you.
Can you go over the assumptions that went into that distribution on the pie chart, like the very first chart that showed 60%, I think, were local cost, and it sounded like you were including their LCFF funding as part of their local?
Yes, that's right. So this is SACS data, the standardized account code system that is maintained by the Department of Ed. And it just is a query on the SACS data that asks, for special ed, it's an accounting system, right? So you go over and you say, well, how much did you spend on special ed? And what's the source of that? So we don't have any way, in that, well, I guess I don't know that. We did not separate out LCFF as a funding source, base grants. So we probably could have done that, but in this study we didn't.
As the state is thinking about early childhood education, do you have any thoughts on how we include the needs of preschoolers and infants with special needs in the conversation?
Yeah, so we look a little bit at how kids are being served in existing preschool programs. The Head Start has a requirement that you serve a certain percent of kids. I think it's 10%. I'm hoping somebody knows that number, but and they actually beat that number. They have the year I looked, they had 11% of their kids were identified as disabled, whereas in the state preschool we don't do so well. And I know there have been efforts in the past to try to boost that percentage. But they haven't really been very successful. We talk about this a little in some detail in the report. But I do think, trying to have special ed kids or disabled kids participate in regular programs when that's feasible is an important goal, to work towards, as well as having, other kinds of programs, separate programs.
Thank you. So I think what you're saying as a solution by using Tularia and Calaveras as examples is that districts should actually shift their mindset in terms of more inclusive practices, so kind of more front-end work to address special education. But we also know that in a lot of school districts, the special education cost has gone so high that it has derailed districts from doing a lot of things for the general population. I'm wondering if you might have actually looked at, and we also know that special ed is not one category. You know, it's students with, there's a wide range of needs that students have, even though they're all lumped together as special ed. I'm wondering if you might have gone through deeper and looking at the types of special education that's there in terms of what's feasible, in terms of what's possible in pulling in the inclusive practices versus pieces where that can't be done.
Yeah, no, we didn't get down to that level. We did look at data about how California compares to other states in terms of inclusion, and we don't do that well. So it seems clear that there's ways that we can improve, but we didn't get into that issue in detail.
Paul, I thought I remembered that you also addressed the issue of equalization and the fact that, yeah, that's a big one for this conversation, if you wouldn't mind addressing.
I just very briefly talked about the fact that the average is about $500 per student that AB 602 supplies for every student in a district. But the range is pretty amazing. It goes from about 450 to about 1,000. There's one district, I think, at the very top that gets 1,000. There's districts in the top 10 percentile, though, that get like 700 or something like that. So there really is an issue about why some districts get more than other districts on a per pupil basis. And we have a recommendation in the first report. I had one line in here, but I was kind of trying to finish up. That where we said, you know, we think equalization is actually a worthy way to spend money to make that fairer. So that's.
Thank you. I had a question about the two counties that you compared and the different ways they're approaching special education. And I agree, it seems reasonable that one county, if they want to deliver services, wouldn't identify students and provide those services before identifying them, where another county might not. I guess my question is, if we're identifying students in different ways around the state, I can imagine that being problematic for our accountability system, in that we pull out special education students to see how well we're serving them. So I just wondered if you could respond to that.
Yeah. So the other half of the report is on governance and accountability. And on accountability, we said, hey, you know, the differences in these two counties are pretty stark, right? If you have 8% of your kids that are considered disabled compared to 18%, then how are you comparing them for the purposes of accountability? You know, if you've got 8%, your kids are probably more severely disabled than the county that has 18%. And so comparing them seems like it's kind of apples and oranges. So we do look at that issue. We talk about how growth seems to make more sense to us than levels. I mean, the other issue is you end up in special ed. Most kids, or a large percentage of special ed kids, end up in special ed because they're not thriving in class. They're not keeping up with the rest of the class. And so, gee, guess what? Special ed kids don't test as high as other kids. Wow, go figure, right? I mean, that's why they're there, because they're not achieving at levels that we would like. So the levels aren't really very meaningful. And what is meaningful is that they make progress, that they grow, and maybe they can narrow that gap over time, you know, and reach levels that are consistent with the rest of the students. But so.
We should just have one level across the state?
One level.
Or how do we disaggregate special ed in this, following your critique?
Well, I don't have an answer about how accountability ought to work for special ed. But I do think it's pretty clear that the existing system that we have doesn't make a lot of sense.
Any more? Oh.
I would ask a question. I would actually like to.
I didn't ask one for you.
Oh, I know. Well, I actually know very little about special ed requirements and facilities, and I think there is an overlap. And I mean, I know that, and these folks can correct me, but there's some, there are some facility funds for special ed on new construction and modernization. But I was just wondering, like in your research, did it come up in terms of the needs? Because I hear it anecdotally talking to local districts and whatnot. And I was just wondering if what you had learned in that and kind of where you see things going or the needs.
Yeah,
expanding.
no, special ed didn't really come up. It's, you know, when you talk about AB 602, you're really talking about the operational side. And so it's probably not the same people almost, right? That I didn't talk to the right people to get that kind of information.
Paul, I was just wondering if there aren't any more questions on finance, if you wanted to go over your content on governance and accountability. That
Well, I
you
only
prepared.
have one slide. So this is like the little tail on a chart of a much larger chart that tracks a cohort of kids from the age of 3 to the age of 19. And it's like the graduating class of 2015 or 16. And it tracks the number of students and their disability category over that time period of kids who are identified in special ed. And after age 6, this little sliver becomes half of all students. Not because this shrinks, because this expands so much. And what it tells you is that special ed is a real dynamic population. A lot of people think, oh, once you're identified for special ed, you're identified as a kid because you can tell that they have a special need that needs to be addressed. And then that's the end of it. You're always a special ed and you're always the same. It's just not true. Kids are changing categories. Kids are graduating. My daughter was special ed because she had a speech impediment when she was young. Was in special ed for 1 year, got it fixed up, moved on, graduated. You can see speech here is the biggest category, right? Because it's a real obvious way of understanding that, oh, there's something going on with this student that needs more, more services or more investigation. So when you think about accountability and you think about all this change, it really affects the data a lot about what grade you're looking at, how many new kids there are, and then, if you have differences between districts, then that adds another factor. So all of these things affect the way that you think about accountability and the validity of the data that you're looking at. And, it's really a way of saying we have a lot we have to learn in this area because we don't exactly know what we're doing. And, in the first year of LCFF accountability, 120 districts were put in a watch status because their special ed results were so poor, right? Well, it's kind of interesting to me about looking in those districts and trying to understand what's really going on with those students and validating, are those students really doing poorly, or is it some artifact of data that we're not really aware of? The other issue that we talk about in terms of governance was in our first report, we said, SELPAs require districts to participate in often a county-wide collaborative for how kids get served. And not all SELPAs are happy with the services that they get. And it kind of forces sometimes districts into arrangements where financially they're disadvantaged or programmatically they feel like they aren't that happy with the service. So we had recommended that we allowed districts to join any SELPA that they wanted. That didn't go over well. And so in this report, we added a number of questions to a survey of superintendents and asked them, how do you like your SELPA? What would you like your SELPA to do that it's not doing now? And, really, most of them said we really like our SELPA. And of course, many of the superintendents were a member of this, they were on the SELPA board, right? Because that's who controls SELPAs by and large. But there were a few that said, yeah, if I could get out, I would. And you can see that districts are leaving their SELPAs, the ones that can because they're large enough, or they group together with another one to become large enough to become their own SELPA. The problem is really acute in LA County, but it happens in other places as well. So we wanted to, you know, say, hey, this is what we found. Superintendents are not that unhappy with their SELPAs. But I think from our standpoint, it's it's empowering districts to make their own choices is kind of how we view it. If they're happy with their SELPA, we think that's great, right? But the kind of forced marriage that you have of SELPAs, that's one way you could look at it, I guess, isn't very respectful to districts who might have their own and better ways to run their own programs. So we just leave it at that. We don't have a recommendation exactly. So those are those two issues.
Great. Thanks, Paul, so much. Seminar on pensions on January 18th. So please mark your calendars and plan to come to that. Should be an engaging time. And on February 1st, we have our annual conference, also here in Sacramento, where we'll be bringing in folks to talk about promising practices in response to a lot of the challenges that we've highlighted in our Getting Down to Facts research. So we hope to see you all there as well. Thanks again for coming.